when I got to college, the cheapest beer that you could buy was Shinerbach, which was actually a pretty good beer from a brewery down in Shiner, Texas. And we drank it because it was cheap, and then it was also good. And so that was great until I then grew up, and all of a sudden microbreweries are all the rage. Now you have to pay like $8 a six-pack for it in the stores. Depressing, but
Shinerbach is expensive now?
yeah, Shinerbach is like $7.50, $8 a
But
six-pack.
it used to be cheap.
Used to be the cheapest thing you could buy in
That's
Texas.
funny.
Yeah, no, it was the go-to college beer because it was just dirt cheap.
So now
How much
people
was
like
beer
it's
back
like
then?
nicer beer.
Yeah, people, it's a
It's like
microbrew now.
nicer
Yeah,
beer.
yeah.
Wait, how much was beer back then for like a six-pack?
Oh, I don't know. $3, something like that.
Oh my god, dude. Wow.
Well, it was a long time ago.
So, yeah, I know, but like, oh, so nice.
All right. We've been talking about history, and if I recall, we ended up kind of in the Dust Bowl. Dust Bowl, and then talking about responses to the Dust Bowl. So let's step back a couple of steps, and I think I forgot my markers. I did, I forgot my bag of markers. Hopefully something up here will function. So we were talking about the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act. And we talked about the kind of provisions that were in there. One of the provisions that we didn't talk about that's still in place today is a federally funded or federally backed crop insurance program. And this became especially important during the Dust Bowl years. So before the Great Depression, there was this problem of overproduction and lack of a market for agricultural goods, and as a result, price was depressed because you had this mismatch between supply and demand. And so one of Roosevelt's goal with the Agricultural Adjustment Act was to essentially stabilize prices. This resulted in them putting into place a set of policies by which they would subsidize farmers to basically take acreage out of production. The result of this is that supply went down, demand once again stays constant for food because, just because food is cheap, it doesn't mean that you're going to eat more food. And that served to reduce production, which then raised prices so that farmers can make a living without unnecessarily burdening the American public. But then shortly after this kicked in, we got to the Dust Bowl years, which were here right in the middle of the 1930s, this period of 8 out of 10 years of being significantly below normal in terms of rainfall. Coupled with the efforts to reduce production altogether, what happened was we ran into food shortages during this time period, and prices shot up, such that by 1938, when it came time to renew the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938 was focused not just on price supports for farmers, it was focused on both price supports as well as ensuring supply. And I think about here is where we ended up with on Friday. And so what the federal government did at that point was, in an effort to encourage farmers to get back into production so that we didn't go through the types of food shortages that drove up prices during the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl years, they basically continued to subsidize farmers for conservation if farmers wanted to do that, but they also set up what came to be known as the ever normal granary. And Poland mentions this just in passing in The Omnivore's Dilemma. This was a system that was advocated by I think it was Treasury Secretary Henry Wallace. And it's based on the old biblical story about storing up 7 years of grain during years of plenty so that could be dispersed during periods of want, during drought. And the idea here is that during periods of overproduction, what happens when you have overproduction to price?
Down.
Price goes down. And so what the government would do is it would give loans to farmers, what they called no recourse loans. They would give loans to farmers such that on a per bushel basis you could take out a loan from the government for X amount of money per bushel. And what you would do as the farmer is rather than sell that on the market, you would store that. And so basically the government was giving you a loan to store your grain rather than selling it that year. And over time what this would do is it would build up a store of grains that would then be available to be let onto the market during periods of low productivity agriculturally, when you could then release that grain onto the market, which would ensure a food supply for the American public at a price that wasn't exorbitant. Because what happens during periods of low grain supply is food prices go up because supply is decreased, and so you can sell the stored grain to lower the price. And the other thing that it does for the farmer is it ensures them that they have grain to sell during that time period. And so the government basically set up this system by which it would pay farmers to store grain and would compensate them for that, because the farmers needed some compensation for this low price grain during times of high supply anyway. So one of the things that you have to recognize about farming from an economic standpoint is you can think of agricultural productivity so during some years you have good years, a good year, if we want to call it that, where you have plenty of rainfall but not too much rainfall, it's not too hot in the summer, et cetera, et cetera. Your agricultural productivity is high. And during a bad year, like this year, when one of the problems with many of the farmers here in the Midwest, which was too much rain and their fields were flooded until it was too late in the year to plant, and they lost an entire year of productivity. In some cases you get these bad years because of things like drought. In the bad year, agricultural productivity is low. But when we look at price during these years, what happens when you have a good year agriculturally in terms of the productivity of your corn crop, for example? Price goes down. So from a farmer's perspective, you have lots of grain to sell, but because of the supply, you have to sell it really cheap, such that you may not make what it costs you to grow it per bushel. In a bad year, what happens to price? Price goes up because you have reduced demand. So you have relatively expensive crop to sell, so you get a high price, but you have less crop to sell. So in a good year, from an economic standpoint, it's not necessarily a good thing for farmers because you have lots of crop to sell, but generally if you're having a good year, your neighbor is having a good year, and your neighbor over there is having a good year, everybody's having a good year. So all of this production leads to low prices. So even if you have a good year, it's not necessarily good for you economically because you have a lot of product to sell, but you're selling it at a very low price. In a bad year, it's like, woo, prices go up, but unfortunately you don't have all that much to sell. So basically, from an economic standpoint, who wants to go into farming? Any takers on starting a farm? It's really dicey from an economic standpoint. And so what the government decided to do is, during good years, pay farmers above market value for their crop to store it, so that then that grain was available during bad years to reduce the cost of food for the American public, and also, once again, providing income for farmers. Normally, you would store a little bit of grain year to year as a farmer, but you wouldn't store large amounts of grain because storage was expensive, which is why the government gave out loans for building storage facilities. Yeah?
So for the government loans, is that something that the farmers have to pay back?
They were called no recourse loans, so if you didn't pay them back, the government wasn't really all that worried about it. And so usually the loans were essentially the government subsidizing the building of granaries. So I don't know how many of you are from Kansas City area. Remember going down I-35, if you're going south on I-35, just north of the river, there were these gigantic silos, big brick silos that they tore down a couple of years ago, and now there's, I think, a fancy jewelry store down there where there used to be. Those kinds of silos and grain storing facilities were built during this period of heavy grain and any dry commodity grains, so corn and wheat and milo and things like that, as well as soybeans and anything that could be stored dry, could be put in these big grain elevators and stored, and those all for the most part were subsidized by the federal government. No individual farmer would have the money to build a facility like that, but a lot of those grain silos were owned by co-ops, and so a bunch of people were getting loan payments from the government subsidizing them during these years of high production. They would pool their money in a cooperative. That was one of the reasons that these cooperatives arose, and in the process of pooling all of that money, they were able to build these facilities. And this was kind of the way we handled price supports up until the early 1970s. So yeah, they weren't, the intention was never to have that money necessarily come back to the government. The purpose was to fund these grain storage facilities that essentially were kind of viewed by people as property of the government because of the way they were paid for. It's a weird thing to get a no recourse loan from the government. So the Dust Bowl years, and I showed you these pictures last time, literally the topsoil blowing away led to changes to the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938. They needed a replacement to the 1933 Act because, as Sydney pointed out the other day, it was deemed unconstitutional because the payments that they used to subsidize farmers for taking acreage out of production were actually paid for by charging taxes on food exporters, grain exporters. And the Supreme Court at the time deemed it unconstitutional to tax one set of the populace, one segment of the economy in order to pay off another segment of an economy, which seems weird because it seems like that's the very nature of taxes. We tax one part of the economy to pay for another part of the economy all the time. But anyway, back in 1933, that was deemed unconstitutional. The 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act was also challenged and was deemed to be constitutional at that time, so it stuck around. So we had this ever normal granary from basically the mid-30s until 1973, essentially. And over this time, what happened was agricultural productivity got better and better over time. And so by the end of the 1960s and going into the early 1970s, we had so much grain and beans and dried stored agricultural commodities that it was becoming actually prohibitively expensive to continue this program. And when Nixon came into office, his department, his agriculture secretary, a guy named Earl Butz, was looking for ways of basically reducing this kind of price support commitment that the government had made that had resulted in these super huge surpluses that were basically becoming more and more expensive every year. We also talked about other government programs that were in this place. These are civilian conservation corps camps. I mentioned last time that there used to be a civilian conservation corps camp right off the edge of the campus here back in the day. So once again, during the Depression, Roosevelt's response to the Depression was spend a shitload of government money to put people back to work, to keep farmers in their jobs, creating food for the American public, and for taking all of these unemployed people and putting them back to work, primarily working on public works projects, infrastructure projects. Last time we talked about how that was not the response to the 2018 recession. And too bad about that because our infrastructure is in need of some work. So we were working our way out of the Great Depression, and then what happens at the end of the Great Depression, and to a certain degree, helps put an end to the Great Depression. Hmm?
World War II?
Yeah, so 1939, Germany marches into Poland, starts World War II, takes the United States less time to get into this war than the last war. We entered in 1941, December 7th, the day that will live in infamy. And at this time, all of a sudden, all of this infrastructure that the federal government had been funding to basically, essentially spend America's way out of the Great Depression begins to come in really handy. Because one of the things that happened as a result of World War II was America really ramped up its manufacturing. Oh, this is more Depression stuff. This is ever normal granary. So this is basically a storage facility that is essentially being paid for by the government back in the 1930s. So World War II comes along. All of the men of fighting age go off to war, but the United States needs to be building tanks and planes and battleships and things like this. And so who do they turn to? Did you guys watch Saturday Night Live ever? Did you watch it this weekend? Oh, there was a sketch this weekend about this thing I'm about to talk about. Little did you know, Saturday Night Live was relevant. Who went to work in factories during World War II? Women went to work in World War II. So you had Rosie the Riveter. The Saturday Night Live sketch is actually about Rosie the Riveter. How strange that that would happen this weekend. I'm not in collusion with the writers at Saturday Night Live. So women went into factories because men, for the most part, went off to war. And the United States as a whole just really ramped up its manufacturing capacity. Hugely ramped it up. Building B-29s, churning out Jeeps by the scores, literally. All in this common war effort, which once again was a bunch of American spending, deficit spending, but what it did was it put a ton of people to work very quickly, spending a lot of money, a lot of cash flow to the populace. This was the beginning of what became the prosperity of the latter half of the 20th century. You guys have well, maybe I should say this, your parents are relatively prosperous because of things that happened back in the 1940s, because not only did we emerge from World War II as the dominant world, one of the dominant world powers, we also inherited this amazing manufacturing capacity as a nation as a result of government investments in war. So for example, Cadillac engines inside of tanks. So you can trace your Cadillac, your Dodge, your Jeep, all of these things that had been traditionally built in what's now called the Rust Belt, the industrial upper Midwest along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. All of that production, all of those facilities were basically World War II facilities that were then repurposed after World War II. And not only did you repurpose them to make Cadillacs and things like this, you also repurposed them to make tractors and combines and the heavy machinery that became useful in farms after World War II. So one of the legacies of World War II is increased manufacturing capacity. And this increased manufacturing capacity led to the automation of farms. So I'm going to refer you back to a figure from that Dimitri et al. Report from 2005. When we look at the number of tractors, no tractors for the most part in 1900, 920,000 tractors in 1930, 2.4 million tractors in 1945, 4.7 million tractors by 1960. The reason that you could produce tractors in mass at prices that farmers could afford is because you had this ramped up manufacturing capacity. A real boon to farming, and as you can see, during this time period, you just have agricultural productivity increasing over time. What other things happened as a result of World War II that helped out farming and productivity of farms? What did soldiers do when they came back after the war?
Had kids.
They had kids, certainly. That's the baby boom. So there was this demographic bump in fertility that's known as the baby boom. I'm not a baby boomer, thank God. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm right on the cusp between the baby boom generation and Generation X. What else did they do other than get busy?
Get jobs.
They got jobs, but what did a lot of them do? Because the federal government set up a program to
The GI Bill,
the GI Bill. Yep. What is the GI Bill?
to help veterans of World War II, establish hospitals, made low-interest mortgages available, and granted stipends, coverage, tutoring, and expenses for veterans attending college and trade schools.
A lot of these people who didn't have advanced educations because they left for the war, essentially right out of high school, when they came back, the federal government's like, okay, you guys went off and won the war for us, we should do something for you. And what they did was they paid for them to go to college. A lot of these guys came off of farms, and as a result, when they got back, they went back to these farming communities, but on the way of going back to these farming communities, what they did was they went to college. Guess what a lot of them studied in college?
Farming.
Agriculture.
They studied agriculture. And so they went off to agronomic programs at schools, funded once again by the federal government. And so they got educated in how to use fertilizers, how to use pesticides. They got educated in how to practice soil conservation, et cetera, et cetera. So they came out well educated. They could get a nice mortgage to put down on a house and a farm, because the GI Bill also helped them with mortgage. And they set up a series of farms, and they became very productive, very successful farmers in post-war years. What also happened to increase productivity during this time? Having to do with munitions plants. Poland also mentions this in the chapter where he talks about Fritz Aber. You might have missed it. It's like one sentence. You guys recall him talking about Bolshol's munitions plant? I think it was in South Carolina in 1947. Repurposed from creating munitions to creating what? What can you repurpose munitions plants for? What's necessary? A necessary component of gunpowder?
Ammonium nitrate?
Ammonium nitrate. So in 1947, the Bolshol's munitions plant was converted to fertilizer production. And a lot of other plants were repurposed to fertilizer production. Not really necessary to produce as many munitions because, one, we weren't at war any longer, and two, why not produce lots of gunpowder? What's in the United States arsenal after World War II that doesn't really require much gunpowder? What's that, City?
Automatic.
No, those all require gunpowder.
Nukes.
Yeah, we had the atomic bomb. And so the atomic bomb basically served as a sort of effective deterrent, but it's not really reliant on traditional munitions. And so we entered the atomic age, which was hopefully going to be a period where people would just be scared enough of nuclear war that we wouldn't have any more wars. But in the same way that World War I was the war to end all wars, then came World War II. World War II was not the war to end all wars. We've basically been in some sort of conflict ever since. Started with Korea, After Korea, we entered Vietnam. After Vietnam, we were involved in all sorts of police actions in other places around the world. And then in 2001, we entered the War on Terror. It hasn't been really a very peaceful latter half of the 20th century and first part of the 21st century. In spite of the fact that we're so far the only nation to ever set off an atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb. But that level of presumed deterrence hasn't done anything to slow down conventional warfare, unfortunately. So we shut down munitions plants or repurpose them to produce fertilizer. Combination of fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, and highly educated farmers led to one of the most prosperous periods in American history, the latter half of the 20th century. A time that I grew up in. I was very fortunate to have grown up in that time, because life was pretty good. I remember when gas was 25 cents a gallon. I remember the fuel crisis of the 1970s during the Carter administration when gas went up to 75 cents a gallon and people were shitting bricks about it. I'm old. So, prosperity throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, basically because of a bunch of New Deal policies that were put in place in the Roosevelt administration and the windfall that comes from surviving and winning a global conflict. Not a bad deal. Questions about any of this? GI Bill. GI Bill, enrollment rate at colleges is going up. Then we go to war, enrollment rates in colleges go down, and then enrollment rates start going up again because in part, the GI Bill. Corn harvest over time. Once again, increasing productivity. Then price controls start going in, or supply controls start going in. You see declines in productivity until, oh, look at that, the very beginning of the 1970s. And what happens there? Corn production starts going up again. What happened at the beginning of the 1970s? Similar graphic here. This is yields per acre, just showing how productivity per acre goes up. But probably the more telling graph is this: increases in productivity up until the years of the Depression, then coming down as a result of New Deal supply programs that are designed to keep prices up, followed by a period of overall total number of harvested acres. What happened in the early 70s that reversed this downward trend in production of food? The wheat sale. Tell us about that, Sydney.
That's just like when, was it Earl Butts? Sold,
It was Earl Butts.
Yeah, all the all the wheat to the Western Russians, and then we didn't have enough for the American people.
Earl Butts was the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon. He was looking at the overnormal granary, looking at all this money being shelled out by the federal government to basically just store a bunch of grain to keep farmers supported, because that kept prices high. And he was looking for a way of kind of getting rid of this or reducing costs for this at the very least. We had been in a Cold War with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russia, if you want to go that way, the USSR. We had been in a Cold War with them since basically the end of World War II. At that point in time, right after World War II, we were the only two nations on the planet that had nuclear arms. And during the late 60s, there was a period of about 10 years when Russia basically went through a series of droughts, kind of like what we went through during the Dust Bowl, and they were vexed with food shortages happened, Earl Butz basically saw an opportunity on two fronts. An opportunity to thaw relations somewhat with Russia. Nixon was already interested in thawing relations with Russia and China, simply because it was also very expensive to continue escalating nuclear armaments. A lot of research and a lot of money invested in that. And so Earl Butz saw an opportunity with the Russian grain crisis. We could essentially do something presumably nice for Russia that would begin to thaw relations with Russia while also reducing the cost of storing all of this grain in the United States. And so in 1972, basically sold off the ever normal granary. Some people think that they sold it at prices that were way too cheap, and so there was a lot of criticism of this, especially because by 1974 we had started experiencing droughts in the United States as well. Our grain supply wasn't in place to supplement markets during times of low agricultural productivity, and immediately prices started increasing. And as a result of this, mothers marched on Washington. They marched on Washington to basically protest rising food prices. And at that point, Earl Butz instituted a new policy for price controls that got rid of the ever normal granary and started resulting in what came to be known as direct payments to farmers. Who can tell me how this direct payment system works? And this is something that I didn't ask you to go and look up, but in the event that you ran across it, does anybody know? And this is the price support system that continues to this day.
You're not talking about how you set the price floor?
Yes, I am talking about that. So I've mentioned that already this semester. Yeah.
They said the price floor, so if it goes underneath, prices were happening underneath this certain floor, the government would pay the difference. So the farmers are, they'll be protected to a certain point.
Yep. So let's say that let's say that the floor is, $2.25 per bushel of corn. If it's not a great year, you have less grain, you have less corn out there on the market because there's less supply, price begins to creep up, and let's say that the market price is $3 for a bushel of corn. You, the farmer, sell your corn on the open market because it's been a poor year from agricultural standpoint, which means that prices are high. And the government doesn't do anything. In a bad year, though, what happens is you have, that's a bad year agriculturally. In a good year, a year when you have high productivity, price therefore is low, and price falls below the floor price. Let's say that now corn is selling at $2 a bushel. What happens is for every bushel of corn that you produce, the government will pay you in a direct payment the difference between the market price for the bushel of corn and what the floor price is. And so you still sell your corn on the market because you have a lot of corn to sell, but then the government will pay you 25 cents for every bushel that you produce. What Earl Butz basically told farmers was, get big or get out of the farming business. After the sale of grain to Russia and the food shortages of the mid-1970s, the stress became not so much on price supports for the American consumer, but on essentially ensuring a steady supply of food for Americans. So we went from from Depression era, which was mainly focused on price supports, to late Depression era, which was price support and food supply, to post-Nixon policy, which was focused almost exclusively on food supply. So if you want to kind of break 3 periods of agricultural policy from the federal government, kind of breaks into these 3 time periods, and the focus of the legislation, the focus of the policies was different. Yeah, Charlie.
Do you think there was ever a time where, before or after this policy was put into place, where like farmers, they say it was like a super bad year and the, or a super high production year and the price was super low, where farmers would keep their corn, and then maybe like a year when it was, the price of corn was higher, they would sell it? Or do you think they weren't financially able to do that because they needed to have the money?
Yeah, so one of the things that you need is you need to usually have this year's money to fund next year's planting.
That's what I figured.
So if you're a farmer, right now what you're doing is you're ordering seed because you're going to be planting in the early spring, and so you're taking whatever money you gained from this past year to essentially fund next year's crop. And then the other thing is food storage is expensive now. And it was expensive then, but there was a federal program to support food storage. So food storage, while it might have been expensive, it was being subsidized by the federal government. Now that food storage isn't being subsidized by the federal government. Have you guys been driving around the Midwest and seeing this new thing that is happening? It's only been, I think, in the last decade or so that I've been noticing this. You'll be driving along a nice flat Midwestern highway, and you'll look out into these fields, and next to a grain elevator, you will see these mounds, and they're stark white. Do you know what those mounds are?
Are those the ones where they keep all their like extra food and they just put the tarps?
Yeah, they're basically, it's a big white tarp that is waterproof, hopefully, and it's basically covering big mounds of corn for the most part. And so now they're storing grain on the ground. This is all commodity corn. It's just dried corn. It's not corn that you're gonna eat off the cob. It's not sweet corn. It's all commodity corn. But because we've lost a lot of these old granaries that ceased to be subsidized by the government back in the early 70s, it's now 40 years later. Over 40 years later. If these things were built back in the 1950s and 60s, during the time that the ever normal granary was in place, those things are in need of repair. They're beginning to crumble and fall down on their own, and so we're having fewer and fewer places to store grain, and so they're actually just storing it on the ground underneath tarps. And so we don't have that kind of infrastructure to support a lot of storage, and so what most farmers do is they are looking for the best market for their product that they can get during that year. So we moved from the ever normal granary to this system of price supports where they basically set the floor price. They set that floor price every 5 years, and so that's the floor price for the next 5 years. And they do this in the Farm Bill, so the Farm Bill is supposed to come up for renewal every 5 years, and that's when all of these prices are set. And then the government essentially makes up any difference during years of high productivity. Many years we have overproduction of crops, and as a result, the subsidy program is a very expensive federal program. There are occasional years like 2007, 2014, when we have droughts in the Midwest where there is a severe underproduction, and what happens is prices go up because there's no long-term storage of these things to let out onto the market to reduce prices. And so the other thing that has happened is what other product do we use corn for other than food?
Gas.
Yeah, we blended into gas. There was a Fuel Standards Act. Oh gosh, now I forgot to look this up before I came to class. Was it 2014?
2000.
2000. 2000? And when did you have to be totally moved over to 10% ethanol? 2007?
Maybe. Sure.
So, hmm?
2011.
Oh, 2011. 2000, this was passed by 2011. You had to be, all fuel producers had to be at 10% blended ethanol into gasoline. Where does this ethanol come from? This ethanol comes primarily from corn. So a portion of this, food, this commodity, corn, dried corn, is now being siphoned off to fund the ethanol production that gets blended into gasoline, because it's a renewable resource rather than a finite resource that you drill down in the ground and extract from oil reserves. The result of this was that during 2007, when the Midwest experienced something of a drought, prices of food went way up, especially meat prices, because this corn, this commodity corn, is oftentimes used to create feedstocks to feed to animals in concentrated animal feeding operations. And as a result, corn was being split into ethanol and also in food production in a period of low productivity. Price of corn went way up, so anybody who was relying on corn was paying more for corn, and as a result, ham and eggs and chicken and beef and everything went up during 2007 and 2009. There was something of a spike in prices, mainly due to once again drought conditions in the Midwest. So if you're a farmer and you want to make money, what should you be doing in terms of productivity on your farm?
Producing a lot and then saving a lot. Producing a lot and saving it for like the next year.
So if you produce a lot, what happens to
But
price?
you save part of it, so you're like producing normal. Technically, that goes into the market, but then you're saving the extra.
Oh, but you don't have any place to store it.
What about the tarps?
Well, those aren't storing a lot of grain. Those aren't
Okay.
storing grain like a normal granary would be able to store. That's a relatively low volume, cheap way of storing grain. And you're not going to be storing it more than a season under those conditions, because while they may be waterproof on top, they're not immune from water in the soil. So it's not a great way of storing corn.
Is it more like a balancing act? Like you don't want to be too productive or poorly productive, but like right in the middle?
No.
I think you still want to be as productive as possible.
Why?
Because, I mean, there's still the floor price, but if you're not productive, like, you're not really gonna make money. Just how economics work.
After Earl Butz changed the policy, farmers started planting what they referred to as fence row to fence row. They basically took whatever land that they had and they turned it into production. Why? Because the more you produce, the lower the price goes. Why farms got so big? Go down to the Missouri River bottom. So go down to New 210, go just south of Liberty on 291, where 291 intersects 210, drive out towards Oric. And what you will see on both sides of the road is you will see corn and soybean fields. Not only is there no fence row, there's no fence. They plant right up to the road, right up to the ditch that separates their farm field from the road. Why? Economically, yeah, no.
So we can take advantage of the 0.25 high productivity.
I have 250 acres to plant, and I plant 200 of it and I leave 50 of it for conservation. That's 50 acres of land that I'm not growing corn on, which is 50 acres of bushels of corn that I'm not having available for sale, because it doesn't matter how much I produce. The more I produce, the lower the price goes, but do I care? I don't, because let's say that I'm producing a lot and everybody around me is producing a lot. and the price goes down to $1.75. So, what happens?
You're still gonna get paid the.
Now the government is gonna pay me 50 cents per bushel. See, I didn't put this up here before. If the government is gonna make up the difference between the market price and the floor price on a per bushel basis, what's it in your best interest to do?
Get as many bushels.
Grow as many bushels as you can. So when your neighbor is old and retired, what do? Buy his land. Why?
So you can produce more.
So you can produce more bushels. Take out that fence so you can plant all the way up to the road. Why? Get more bushels. This is the way you make money in the current way the government subsidizes crops in the United States, is you produce more because regardless of what production is, the government is going to make up the difference between the floor price and the market price. Now, you have to hope, and this is one of the things that farmers complain about a lot, you have to hope that this floor price is sufficient to do what?
Pay for it.
Pay for your expenses in raising that crop and give you some profit as a result after that. And so one of the things that farmers are constantly lobbying Congress about when the farm bill comes up for renewal is what the nature of these floor prices are, what the actual monetary value of the floor price is, because that ultimately determines whether or not you can make it. Because if the floor price is lower than the cost of production, it ultimately doesn't matter how many bushels you make. Even if you're getting the subsidy from the government, you're still not breaking even because it's costing you more to grow that crop than you can get money for that crop. So what this ushered in was a period of increasing size of number of acres that are being harvested. So productivity has improved because we're planting more acres of the crops that we grow because it's in the interest of the farmer to plant more acreage because of the subsidy system as it's currently designed. Yeah, kidding? So you're just stretching. Sorry, I've been up since 3:20.
Why?
My girlfriend had to go to the airport and I couldn't fall back to sleep when I got home, so my eyes are dry. They're dry and pressed. Yeah.
Do you ever think they'll improve this system, or if there is any improving to it to be done?
So if you have to plant 4,000 acres of corn to squeeze as many bushels out of the land that you have that you can in order to take advantage of the subsidy price, what are you probably not doing that you did back in the 1930s and 40s in terms of diversity of crops on your farm? Do you have a lot of diversity of crops? Are you growing peas and carrots and everything else? No, you're probably monoculturing. You're growing 4,000 acres of corn, or 3,000 acres of corn and 1,000 acres of soybeans or something like this. You're growing row crops and you're growing commodity crops. And so remember how we define a commodity?
Something to be stored.
Yeah, it's generally something that can be stored. So traditionally we thought of commodities as things like tin and gold and copper and things like this. But we also think of things like corn, soybeans, and wheat, because these are all dry crops that can be stored for long periods of time if you have a suitable storage facility. And so in some cases, if you're like in the game of trading commodities and you work on agricultural commodities, you might actually find it beneficial to buy up corn at a time period when it's really, really cheap and save it to unload on a market when times are worse, and as a result prices are more expensive. And then the difference between what you paid for it and what you sell it for minus the cost of storing it is actually beneficial to you. This is why we have future traders, people who basically buy crops at a low price in the hopes of storing them and selling them later at a higher price. So the futures market in agriculture is very active, where people are basically gambling on what next year's weather is going to be like. Because the other thing is, the longer you store these things, the more expensive the storage costs are. It adds up over time. And so you don't want to store them for a long time, but most future markets have like a 12-month window that you're trading against. So most farmers have basically gone to monocultures of row crops. And one of the consequences of this type of subsidy is that we tend to have more monocultures, which means that we have less diversity in our food chain. So you have lots of people growing corn, you have lots of people growing soybeans, you have fewer numbers of people growing wheat, you have people growing rice, you have people growing sugar. But most of the sugar that we have now, that you have table sugar, actually comes from beets, not sugar cane. So sugar beets for the production of sugar. These are less common than these. These are the two big agricultural crops. So this floor price is only set for certain crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, sugar. Milo, I think, is in there. You know what's not in this system?
Cotton?
Oh, there's subsidy. There's subsidy for cotton also. Thank you. It's not a crop we eat, so I forget to think about it. But no, it's in the subsidy system as well. What's not subsidized by the federal government? What's not up on the board that you eat?
Meat production.
Meat production is subsidized because we feed a lot of our meat corn and soybeans.
Produce,
Explain what you mean by produce.
like fruits and vegetables.
Fruits and vegetables do not fall under the subsidy system as it currently exists. So, when you go to the grocery store, on a pound for pound basis, what is cheaper to buy? A pound of broccoli or a pound of corn checks? No, corn checks are cheap on a pound for pound basis compared to broccoli or string beans or edamame.
Didn't you say what's cheaper?
Oh, did I say what's cheaper?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said what's cheaper. No, corn checks are really, really cheap. Why are they really cheap?
They're subsidized.
They're subsidized. There's an encouragement, there is an incentive for farmers to grow corn. A federal subsidy for a crop is just the government saying, we want you to grow more of this. That's what the government does. The government, you hear congressmen and senators sometimes saying, it's not the government's job to pick winners and losers in this economy. Well, you know what? You do it all the time. Because we have things like subsidies for industries. When you do that, you're picking winners and losers. And the winners here are corn and soybeans. You
So
have a
are
question?
these subsidies what cause like farmers to switch over to feeding like corn to chickens and cows
So-
and stuff, or was it something else that more?
So traditionally, we would have grazed our cows on pasture.
Yeah.
The problem with that is grass is relatively low nutrition, and so they grow slower. So typically what happens, and this is in a chapter of the book that we haven't read yet, which we probably will read by the time it's all said and done, which is where Michael Pollan buys a cow.
Yeah.
He buys cow 534 from a ranch in South Dakota and follows this cow through the food chain. And it spends about the first 6 months of its life on a ranch in South Dakota, eating grass, doing the things cows evolve to do. What happens to the cow at 6 months?
So
It's not sold, it's still owned by the ranch, but it goes on a ride. This particular cow went on a ride to western Kansas, outside of, what's the name of the town? Holcomb is the town that's near it. Garden City. North of Garden City. After that, for another 6 months, it moved to north of Garden City. To a place.
Is that like a beef processing plant or something?
It is a concentrated animal feeding operation. You know you've left the area of good quality agriculture when you refer to things with acronyms. Luckily for you, I, a number of years ago, put pokey feeders into my Google Earth. Oh, there's pokey feeders. At the time that Michael Pollan went to visit pokey feeders, it was housing about 30,000 cows. So if you zoom in on pokey feeders, you will very quickly see there are lots of little dots on the landscape. Those dots are cows. Those cows are at this concentrated animal feeding operation because what is around this concentrated animal feeding operation? Acres upon acres of corn and soybeans. Why haul all that corn and soybean up to South Dakota when you can just take your cows down to Garden City and feed them where their food is being grown? So the advantage of finishing cattle on grain is that grains are high in energy. Tons of energy, the cows grow really fast, so it gets your cow to market sooner. And so the ranch in South Dakota pays the people at pokey feeders to feed up the cow, get it up to weight so that it's now at a sellable weight, and then the ranch sells the cow, basically pays pokey feeders whatever it costs to feed that cow for those 6 months, and then pockets whatever is left after that as profit. Yeah.
Do cows, like different cows, like sell for higher prices depending on what they eat?
Sure,
So,
yeah.
Like if they're guys are doing it like this way compared to a different kind of cow.
Yeah, so you can go out to Richmond, Virginia. You can talk to Tom and Paula Parker.
Yeah.
Tom and Paul Parker, if you ever talk to Tom in particular, he's fairly outspoken. He is a loud-spoken disciple of Joel Salatin. And he basically raises grass-fed beef, grass-fed chickens, and grass-fed sheep and pigs using basically Joel Salatin's model out just northeast of Richmond, Missouri. And you're gonna pay a premium for that grass-fed beef, those grass-fed chickens and grass-fed pigs and all that. Yeah.
So last semester I studied abroad in
Uh-huh.
Costa Rica, and the cows they had there were like skeleton cows compared to the ones we have here.
Yeah.
Like, literally there was no meat on them, like, it looked like they were gonna die, but that's probably like how they would normally look.
Well, that's not how they would normally look. You have to consider that if you're in Costa Rica, you're basically grazing them on old rainforest land, which is actually terrible in terms of total
But like, we
nutrient
can beef
supply.
up our cows like,
So you're raising them on kind of marginal land because you have low soil fertility, so you don't have super productive grass production after you cut the forest down. Soil fertility goes away relatively quickly, so you're feeding them on really poor pasture, and you're not sending them off to a concentrated animal feeding operation. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that they're on the lean side because they're not going to Garden City.
I just figured it was because, like here in the United States, we beef up our cows basically so they make more, for farmers make more money.
Well, you beef them up, it also makes them taste better. You don't want to buy a steak that doesn't have some marbling in it, some fat some layers of fat in there because the fat adds flavor to it and keeps it from drying out when you grill it and cook it and whatnot. So there are all kinds of reasons, but one of the main reasons is feeding them grains gives them more energy, and so they get to harvesting weight faster. So when you go to Garden City, when you go to Poke Feeders, these animals are being fed a mixture of corn and soybeans and other things to get them to beef up in a faster time period. So in a sense, when we talk about subsidies for meat, they're not subsidized directly necessarily, but they're subsidized because the food that they exist on is subsidized. Yeah.
Does that make them more prone to diseases?
It does, as a matter of fact. Well, maybe I'll just assign that chapter. I'll send it out on
Oh,
Moodle.
it's another chapter. I accidentally read the other chapter.
You accidentally read the other chapter. Yeah, so it messes with their digestive system, makes their digestive system more acidic. They then provide a selective environment for the microbes that grow in their gut, one of which is E. coli. The E. coli are now acid resistant, so that when you get E. coli from improperly composted fertilizer that then goes on vegetable crops, for example, when that E. coli gets to you, one of your body's first defenses against bacteria is the stomach acid that it has to go through, which kills off a lot of microbes, but it doesn't kill off microbes that are coming from cows at concentrated animal feeding operations, because those microbes have been evolving with cows as they've been getting this inappropriate food that changes the pH of their digestive system. So what I want you to do is I want you to do some homework. We don't have class on Wednesday because it is advising day. So between now and Friday, so you have plenty of time to look this up. I want you to look up the food plate. The food plate is the new version of the food pyramid. It's basically it's the visual representation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture dietary recommendations. You can look at the visual of the food plate, but I also want you to go and find the percentages. It basically tells you what percentage of your diet should be dairy versus grains versus meat versus fruits and vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. Find those dietary recommendations. And then the other thing that I want you to do is I want you to find the U.S. subsidy structure. For those things that are in the food plate, grains, meats, dairy, fruits and vegetables, for those things, find out what proportion of the subsidies of those, each of those things make up. And I want you to find somewhere and make a pie graph, a pie chart. You know what a pie chart is? Showing you the recommendations and showing you the subsidies. And do that before Wednesday so that you have from Wednesday to Friday to think about what those two charts look like. Because guess who's in charge of the dietary recommendations? U.S. Department of Agriculture. Guess who's in charge of subsidies to farmers? The U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm sure you can tell from the tone of my voice what it's going to show you when you look at it. I don't know. Maybe. Where have you been?
Here, and soccer.
Why did you not come up? I do have your exam. Yours is the last one that I have. There you go. The average this time was much better than the previous time. It was like 79.5. So high grade was a 96 or something like that, I think. Low grade was a 66, I think, something like that. Yeah. No, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have time right now to speak in your office?
Yeah.
Or if that's a possibility.
Sure. Let me just erase this.
Would you like your iPad?
Hmm?
I don't know if this is still going on.
I think I turned it off.